Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's panel discussion, Climate Adaptation in Nova Scotia, Overblown or Underwater. I am Rodrigo Menafra, the Managing Director of MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction and Response Network, and I'll be your moderator today. As we begin this event, we acknowledge that we are here today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We also recognize the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who have been here for over 400 years. Before we welcome the panelists, I'd like to thank the McEachern Institute for all the work that went into this event and for co-hosting it with MEOPAR. For those of you who are not familiar with MEOPAR, we are a National Centers of Excellence that was formed in 2012 with the aim of developing a coordinated Canadian approach to research addressing ocean and coastal issues, particularly in the face of unprecedented changes. We've partnered with the McEachern Institute on several events covering topics like coastal resilience, coastal risk governance, and climate change. I am very pleased to be moderating today's discussion, where we'll hear from local and global experts on how to adapt to the realities of a changing climate in Nova Scotia and other coastal communities. To start things off, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Patricia Manuel. Patricia is a professor of planning at Dalhousie University and also teaches in the Coastal and Marine Management program at Akureyri University and the University Centers of the West Fjords in Iceland. As a geographer and environmental planner focusing on coastal regions, Patricia's research integrates natural and social systems through policy and plan making. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and thank you, McEachern Institute and MEOPAR for co-hosting this wonderful conversation about shaping the future of our beautiful province in the context of a changing climate. My job today, because we're starting with me, I get to talk a little bit about the Coastal Climate Challenge to get us organized, and then I'll go into bit of background on what we've already accomplished to address the problems, and then reflect on what we're going to need to do to turn ideas into action. We're all aware that our province juts into the North Atlantic. It's a precarious position, to say the least. 70% of our almost 1 million people live along 13,000 kilometers of coastline. Many of us live only a few meters above high tide. We travel along roads that hug the shore. Some of our most treasured cultural and natural assets are distinctly coastal features, and important community infrastructure is located near the water's edge. So we love our coast. And so maybe it's a bit hard for us to accept that our relationship is becoming a bit strained lately. Excuse me. Climate change is forcing us to reevaluate our relationship and maybe make a new and different commitment. So coastal flooding and erosion, these are the two things we're very familiar with, and they're also processes of our coast. Natural processes of coasts everywhere, and but they're happening at a faster pace now, faster than what we're used to dealing with, and they're reaching places not previously impacted. So first of all, we have rising sea level. The historic rate in Halifax Harbour has been measured over the 20th century as 32 centimeters. That rate's a combination of the coastal expression of global sea level rise and then how much our landmass is sinking or settling, which is a process of adjustment of the Earth's crust as it responds to the lingering effects of ice sheets that used to press down on us 15,000 years ago. But now that sea level is rising faster, and locally, while the land will continue to settle, globally, sea level rise is speeding up, and that's because the Earth's atmosphere and oceans are warming. So Canadian scientists have developed projections for sea level rise for Canada's coastline, and they take into account this global rate, global projections that have been developed, as well as the Earth's response to deglaciation around the coasts of Canada. Nova Scotia is leads sea level rise in those projections. We're going to be the hardest hit. At the high end, by 2100, we'll have, that's 80 years from now, we'll be in the range of 79 to 110 centimeters, depending on whether we look at the good or the not so good greenhouse gas emission futures. And by mid-century, we could be looking anywhere from 45 to 50 centimeters of rise along our shores relative to the 2000 levels of sea level. So our baseline reference to sea is changing. We know that. If you think of flat land or gently sloping coastal areas that are now just above sea level, those areas could be flooded by 2100. And how far the seawater intrudes inland is going to depend on how rapidly, the slope of the coast, how fast it rises from the coast inland. So flooding could occur many, many meters inland, depending on the slope. And that's just sea level rise. We have then the immediate problem of storm surge, and that can add a lot of height to the sea level. And that's a big problem when it comes in on high tide. And storm surges will reach further inland to areas not previously impacted. And then when you combine that with something else called wave run-up, which is what it sounds like, it extends the reach of sea level rise even further inland. And then there's erosion, and we can go on. It's really noticeable. We have a lot of experience with it. There are some coasts that are more susceptible to it than others. And sea level rise just and storm surges brings those impacts further inland as well. Some of our coasts are protected by winter ice, but now that the oceans are warmer, the ice is thinner and not as common in those straits, and so erosion gets worse. So, we have these normal coastal processes, and they're becoming more noticeable because of what isn't normal, and that's how close we are to them, and we continue to get in the way, and our land uses and infrastructure, we continue to build where we shouldn't. And we didn't always used to be that close, but the sea is creeping in on us, and in other places the land's falling away. So we build the seawalls and we pile rocks up against the shore to protect ourselves. And in some places we have dikes, which we created at a time centuries ago when we drained marshlands for agriculture. But those dikes weren't meant to protect towns and villages, although in some places they are doing just that right now. And so trying to protect the things we already might have, that's somewhat understandable. But what's not understandable is why we, knowing our situation, continue to do what we do. Build in floodplains and at the edges of these eroding coastlines. And so we're making bad individual decisions. I think we're aware of that, about our own properties, but our governments also continue to permit this behavior because we still don't have the tools in place to control it. Or where we do have them, we're also accommodating exceptions. And while we're building tools, they may not be coming online fast enough. So something to consider is that when we build in these places, we destroy those features that can actually help to protect us. And that's our natural coastal systems and the natural physical structures that can help slow down these incoming waves and absorb wave energy and build sediment back up in place. And instead of giving space to these processes, we take it away. So we put ourselves in its place and then we build our protections around us. And it creates false assurance and it needs constant repair and reinforcement. So instead, we should be making room for the movement we need at the coast because it's going to move despite our best efforts. And we should be attempting to restore this natural heritage that we've lost and that can do a lot for us in protection and resilience. So really quickly, what have we done so far? Well, we've been doing quite a bit actually over the last 12 to 15 years. We're building good capacity to understand the problem. We're developing tools to deal with it. We've been mapping areas all around the province that we now know are prone to coastal flooding now and could be in the future. Mapping erosion is a lot more difficult, but we've been figuring out what infrastructure and land use and people are at risks in areas of flooding over time, over the long term. And then in the early days of mapping, we were using selected municipalities who volunteered for pilot programs, but now we have with Municipal Affairs and Housing, who is working on a comprehensive approach to floodline mapping for the region. This is river mapping, but they're also integrating coastal mapping into their flood mapping as well. Still a pilot in the testing stages, but the hope is that eventually we will be able to provide this mapping guidance around the province to all the municipalities. We've been building our knowledge about flood extent. We've been identifying land use and infrastructure and people who we know are at risk. And we're writing action plans, receiving a lot of attention now. That's a product of 2011 to 2013. Again, environment or housing and Nova Scotia affairs, municipal affairs and housing, excuse me. And that was financed by the gas tax transfer funds managed provincially. And every municipality developed these action plans. They assessed risks, they assigned priorities for adaptation. And they also dealt with the question of mitigation. The question is now, what's happening with these strategies and are we seeing implementation? And that's always a very important aspect of what we have to be thinking about. We're also creating legislation and regulations to improve our land use planning. We have a requirement for mandatory planning now that we didn't have before. So areas that didn't have it previously will have it. And land use planning is a very important tool for climate adaptation. We have the new Coastal Protection Act. We will have, with the regulations, eventually a minimum horizontal and vertical setback for all these coastal developments in the province. The thing is, though, we have to see that implemented, and there will be exceptions within that. So we have to be careful to see what that's going to imply. And we're developing these great new techniques that we can use to heal our coast. So rather than using these rocks and walls to protect ourselves, we'll be using nature to help us reinvigorate our coastlines and provide protection that we need. And this is an international movement. It's also acknowledged by the Canadian Council of Environmental Ministers. And it's a growing community. We have a growing community of researchers and people who normally work at the coast and property owners willing to try something new. So now we have to bring government on board with their policies and hopefully eventually legislation and regulation as well, because you know, everybody has to work together on seeing these things evolve. And so that's all good news, but we need action and not just good news about knowledge. So we need the resources to support the people with the know-how to get the work done. That includes everybody. So people inside and outside of government, NGOs, private sector, people in the communities, and especially those who own coastal property. And we need to make all this information widely available to all those groups so they can understand not only why they have to do it, but how. And then we have to move ahead with not only building the tools that we need, but also moving ahead with using them. And we need these policies and laws to make sure that we have not just paper laws, but also laws in action. And that means political leadership. So they have to lead us forward in this. And of course, the big one is money. We need the funding commitment, and we have to find money for adaptation. It's going to happen. A lot of it will happen in small communities. They don't have the local funds to support it. And perhaps that's something we can talk about in the discussion. So the main message is here, we've been building capacity and now we have to use it. So I will end there and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to the discussion coming up.
Thank you, Patricia. I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Steve Plant. Steve is a professor at Université du Québec at Rimouski, and his research focuses on adaptive governance, resilience, adaptation, and community-based management in relation to climate change. Steve is also part of the MIOPAR network and leads a project on how to move forward with adaptation and resilience plans in coastal and river zones in Quebec and Ontario. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Hello, everybody. I'm very glad to be here today to talk with you, to take a part of this discussion about what I'm doing since more than 20 years. I work until 2016 in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, and now I'm working in Quebec always on the topic of adaptation, climate adaptation and adaptive governance, like Rodrigo said. I just want to divide my speech in two parts. The first part is what we learned in our research project when we were working with the communities about adaptation. And after, I could suggest or give some prospective element to integrate, to be more resilient, if I can say that, in the adaptation processes. First of all, like Patricia said, we learn the distinction between the different jurisdiction, a provincial or a federal jurisdiction in climate change. In Quebec is, for example, is a provincial jurisdiction, And all our gas tax, invest our money in mitigation, like and adaptation. We are not always investing since few years, or in very few money. We know the oversimplification or overrepresentation of certain perspective, like, for example, natural and technological perspective, forgetting social sciences perspective, taking into like an evidence social aspect, because everybody could understand social because we are a social people. Probably it's the influence of a positivist reflection, positivist and observation bias in sciences. But in social sciences, we begin to work with economic and psychological topic, but it's just beginning. For example, we put a lot of millions of dollars in ecological resilience and cents for social resilience in front of the climate change effect. After that, we know the scientific data is needed, but is becoming a pretext to not act. For example, we are justifying and not acting by a lack of knowledge. Mapping risk zone is not enough. Satellite imagery, it's not. We don't have any money to do that. And we forget the temporal dimension and of the people or of the phenomenon. The last one topic is usually when we work with the coastal community, they are focusing on erosion, submersion, flooding, but forgetting all the other kind of possible adaptation to the drying episodes, groundwater, type of strategy involved. What are the lessons we have from other topics, focusing always on the vulnerability, not on the resilience aspect, and we focus on we not focus enough about uncertainty, saying but it's sure and uncertainty uncertain we are confronting climate change. I'm sorry, I lost my mind in English. Well, it's the four aspect we perceive, if I can say that, sharing with Quebec and New Brunswick, for example. And now I can introduce some perspective elements. We know working with the communities, helping to facilitate the adaptation. For example, we use a participative government, co-construction, and not only use the consultation processes. Consultation processes, it's a very passive way to enter in a participative governance. And this active participation in governance, co-construction, etc., favorize the appropriation of the process and the social acceptance of solution created by the actor involved. Erosion, the second element is erosion is not only erosion, is an asset of a territory occupation or preoccupation, like a devitalization after a storm or something like that. The coastal community are not only vulnerable, but could be source of learning, experiences, resilience, and opportunities for changes. The third one is work with the communities and not work for. Sometimes sometimes this particularity is an important ingredient to acceptability. A short-term perspective research usually is used like researching state of equilibrium, but forgetting the importance of the dynamic of process and cultural context and immaterial consideration for the adaptation. We are not only working with material consideration, we work with population, we work with the people, they have emotion and they have a perspective. I can stop there and thank you for listening. If you have some questions.
Thank you, Steve. Next up is our third speaker, Dr. Robin Cox. Dr. Cox is the director of the Resilience by Design Lab at Royal Roads University, where she designs and oversees a diverse applied research agenda focused on building leadership for climate action and disaster risk reduction. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the McEachran Institute and MEOPAR for this opportunity to join you on the other coast of Canada. Living here as I do on the unceded lands of the Coast-Sampson and Algonquin people and families on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, I can say that we share many of the same risks, climate-related risks that Patricia outlined, and we face risks and other risks across the country. We know climate change is going to have enormous physical, social, health, and financial impacts. And I guess what I'm going to speak about is the need to face that reality that even our best efforts at reducing GHG emissions and slowing global warming, urgent action is needed, definitely, but we can also agree that we have not lived up to our best efforts. Even with those efforts, we are going to face unavoidable climate impacts and foreseeable risks. For the past 15 years, I have been teaching in the Disaster and Emergency Management program at Royal Roads University. And we know from the extensive historic and recent research in disasters that we tend to have a ubiquitous and persistent tendency to plan and act in response to rather than in anticipation of. We're often planning with a rear view mirror perspective, as a colleague from the Institute of Climate Choices says. So I think, we're in a moment in time where we are facing a pandemic that illuminates that as well, that continued tendency. We know that the pandemic surprised many people, but it was not unforeseeable. The evidence was clear and has been for decades. We knew that a pandemic would happen. It was foreseeable in the context of the rise of zoonotic diseases, in the context of increased global travel and migration and urbanization and global economic activities. The timing and the exact nature of the pandemic was unpredictable, but the eventuality was foreseeable. Similarly, we know that with the rise of global heating comes foreseeable, if unpredictable risks. As Patricia has already mentioned, sea level rise and flood-related risks, droughts, increased wildfires, a rise in severe pandemics and other health-related threats, increases in massive migration, climate-forced migration, and conflict. These are already happening and their escalation is foreseeable and scientifically documented in climate projections. The fact that we do not know exactly when and how these will play out should not preclude our preparation and our taking strategic, systematic actions to reduce those risks, to prepare for and adapt in advance of those risks, and to build our shared resilience capacity to meet the challenges we are facing and those that are to come. What binds us together here in Canada and really throughout the world is our need to face forward, acknowledge these extreme projected risks, and act. As a colleague from the Institute for Climate Choices says, it's time to pull back the curtain. And we've seen some of that happening. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is calling for widespread disclosures of climate-related risks, physical, social, economic, etc. But then we also need to invest in adaptation in ways that support municipalities and small rural communities, individuals and businesses being able to respond proactively to ramp up their adaptation investments. So as we've already heard, climate change adaptation, awareness, and capacity building are happening here in Nova Scotia, as in British Columbia and other parts of the country. But I'm going to argue that they're happening too slowly and not keeping pace with the urgent need to implement strategic actions in land use planning and natural asset, nature-based solutions, financial investments, etc. When it comes down to it, climate change is about people. People not only as victims or as vulnerable populations, but people as actors and agents of change. And we need legislators and regulators to understand this, to establish and activate mechanisms that prompt our investment in our shared whole of community adaptation capacity. This means in things that have already been mentioned, establishing codes, standards, regulations, and enforcing them. But it also requires a consideration of adaptation and resilience across all sectors. It needs to be systematically integrated into everything that we do. We need to systematically and rapidly upskill the workforce across all sectors, and not only to support the transition to a green and clean economy, which is the current focus, but also, and just as importantly, to invest in education and training across the workforce to increase the awareness and understanding of the risks, the unavoidable risks, to have the knowledge, skills, and capacities necessary to our ability to act to reduce those risks where we can, to plan and prepare for the risks that we can't avoid, those locked in climate risks, and to support the psychological, physical, emotional, social resilience of individuals and communities in the face of those risks. And I'm going to argue that that means that we need to mobilize our capacity building institutions. I work in one. I work in a university, and really our primary mandate as universities, schools, colleges, etc., is capacity building, skills and knowledge development. But we also need governments and private sector organizations to invest and activate capacity building, to motivate, educate, and train and reward workers in every sector, companies in every sector, boards of directors, and government leaders who integrate adaptation into their work and who mobilize strategically to implement these adaptation measures, as again, Patricia's already called for. In the Resilience by Design Lab, our work focuses on this goal. We've built a climate adaptation competency framework to help support the work that we and others do with youth and working professionals and communities to guide this capacity building and to start developing standards and expectations about what those capacities are, what those competencies are, and ensuring that those are integrated, implemented, and enforced across all sectors. We need this kind of upskilling. It's also why we've launched, and I know that other programs in the Maritimes are also doing this, launching programs that relate to climate action. We're launching a climate action leadership program. And the reason we're doing that is we want to invest in the capacity of leaders across all sectors, formal and informal leaders, to take on this monumental task of adapting to climate-related risks. We want to really design resilience not only through our program, through any of these programs, but collectively. We want to design resilience and build it into our systems, whether those are healthcare, economic, every business sector. All our systems need to be resilient, and the people that those systems serve also need to be resilient. And this needs to build in a socially just and equitable orientation to adaptation, as we know that from the pandemic and from many other instances, the climate change impacts will not be felt ubiquitously or fairly across all populations. So this is really an urgent, I think, emphasis on where we need to go, and particularly at this moment in time. I'll finish off by saying that I think we're at one of these unprecedented, or not really unprecedented, we've been in them before, but in terms of the scale, unprecedented moments in time, a pivotal moment in time, where governments across the board are investing in upskilling, in employment, in restarting the economy. And we need to expect them to call on them to include adaptation in those investments in the same way that they're including clean and green energy and mitigation measures in that, so that we are building towards an adaptive and resilient future. So thank you for that, and back to you, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to welcome our fourth and final panelist, Scott Vaughan. Scott is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IISD, and International Chief Advisor, China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. Previously, he has been the IISD President and CEO and Chair of the Experimental Lakes Area and Canada's Federal Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Over to you, Scott.
Great. Rodrigo, thank you very much. And I'll really just to say thanks for convening such an interesting and timely panel. And to say I've agreed with all the comments of the previous speakers. So let me just very briefly, there's been an enormous amount of attention on climate change, certainly in the last 10 years and after the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Both the attention of governments, the private sector, financial markets has increased. But I think as we've heard from previous speakers, most of that attention is on the mitigation side. And the climate adaptation agenda has typically been kind of the poor cousin at the table as markets and governments and businesses are looking at decarbonization and mid-century carbon neutrality targets. I mean, I think the good news is that's changing. It's creeping up in the agenda within countries. Some examples of that, there was a summit last month hosted in January by the Dutch government on climate adaptation. Canadian Prime Minister and others made commitments. And you're seeing now there's at least sort of an ordering of how to think about this from a policy side. And it's really around, thinking about how to defend, how to adapt, and how to retreat or abandon in face of what are inevitable impacts of climate change around the world, including or particularly, especially in Nova Scotia. Coastal flooding is ranked as one of the top climate impacts in Canada. And as we've heard from Patricia and others, this is only going to magnify as global warming continues and accelerates. So within that, just I make 3 quick points. And the first one is, as we've already heard from Patricia, I mean, I think that, Nova Scotia is, I think, one of the leading provinces within Canada on moving forward with adaptation plans at the community level from the 2011, 2013, 2014 use of the gasoline tax. And now scholars have gone back and looked at that. Brennan Vogel as one, and other, and Gordon McBean have looked at this and said, that what Nova Scotia has done is an example not only for the rest of Canada, but also for other countries on thinking about how to build up the capacity around climate adaptation. So I mean, that's really important. And a researcher, David Reiter, came up really interesting work looking at, well, the plans were put in place, what about implementation? And he went back and looked at 20 examples, including in Halifax and Digby, in Cape Breton and Cumberland, Colchester, Counters, Chester, and others. And he said of the measures that were identified at the community level, there was an uptake of about 75%. So that's really important. And within those, the sort of the top candidates were, 1, land use planning, don't build or rebuild on floodplains. I mean, it's something everyone knows, but it still continues. To look at emergency preparedness, to look at, I think what both Robin and Patricia and Steve all emphasize is this importance of capacity building among municipal councils, among the public, and especially around vulnerable populations, Indigenous communities, those who are economically and socially disadvantaged and marginalized. And so that work has been underway. And I think just to underscore that, just thinking about the climate agenda, on the mitigation side, there's about 5 big actions that can take place that can have a really big impact. Decarbonization of the electricity sector, scaling up electric automobiles. By contrast, adaptation is at the local level. The best way in order to build adaptation is by understanding the vulnerabilities at the community level. Topographies are different, demographics are different, equity issues are different. The age of infrastructure is different. And so the work that Nova Scotia has done, I think, is really important. My second point, though, is that anybody that's worked on a strategic plan knows that almost the moment you finished it, it's out of date. And so I think it's really important for those plans that are now coming on 8 years old and longer to dust them off and to go and re-engage. Council members change, people in the community change, new buildings are built, old buildings are abandoned, etc. So I think it's really important to say, where are we? And also what can be done at the household level, as well as at the governmental level, to look at what can be done, looking at sewage, sewage backwater flow pipes, for example, is one example, or, don't put all your electronics in the basement if you're in a flood zone area, etc. And so just updating those. But I think within the update, it'd also be important to say that Ottawa in January announced that they are going to release a national adaptation plan. I think then this is a chance for Nova Scotia to be at the table, certainly to engage with Ottawa, but also to think about new funding opportunities to support the implementation of those plans. And also just looking at what Infrastructure Canada is thinking about now is not only reinforcing gray infrastructure, bridges, roads, etc., but also shifting to nature-based solutions. And again, this is an area where Nova Scotia, I think, is providing real leadership, restoring salt marshes, for example, in the Bay of Fundy, looking at what's happening around Fort Lawrence and the Tantramar marshes on breaking up some of the older gray infrastructure and restoring some of the natural coastlines and dynamics within the ecosystems. My last point is really one that I'm sure we're all thinking about, and I'll just give Rodrigo 20 seconds, and that is, it's Robin's last point, is that when we think about risk, we tend to think about what we have known. We think about what's happened recently in the past, and we then assume that is going to continue in a linear fashion. So if you look at Halifax projections, 50% centimeter increase in sea level rise in the port of Halifax at mid-century. But for those of you that follow this, and Rodrigo, this is probably in your area of oceans, but there's really a big story that's come out in the last couple of weeks, and the disruption of the Gulf Stream. And that, to me, is an example, a really profoundly worrying example, that tipping points happen, and you then get into cascading and nonlinear effects where it's very difficult to anticipate what the impacts of those are. And just from that observations on what's happening with the Gulf Stream, it has an immediate and profound impact on Nova Scotia because of higher sea level levels, as well as more frequent and intense extreme weather events. So with that, I'll end it. Rodrigo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was fantastic. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and expertise. I think especially for sharing so many forward-looking proposals and ideas. I think what's next is we're going to just have 10-15 minutes of a focused panelist discussion. I'll just get us started with some questions I've prepared, and then we will for sure leave time for some questions from the audience that I'm already seeing are coming in. The audience is quite engaged. So for all panelists, I think something important that some of you have alluded to, there's a lot happening across Canada. And so it's interesting to see, and I want to hear from your perspective and experience, what is being done or can be done better to increase cooperation, exchange of experiences, lessons learned across Canada, basically sharing that knowledge among coastal communities on how to adapt and increase their resilience. So, anybody can take it away and we can have that discussion.
Well, I'll jump in with some thoughts on that. I mean, I think, being as transparent as possible, and I know that there are lots of considerations in how we share data and what data we share, but ultimately we need to be able to share that widely so that we can coordinate planning. These are not, I mean, there are very regional and local impacts, but we need to understand how these all intersect, I would say, is one. And I would say that, governments are still very siloed, as are educational institutions, as are many things in our society. And somehow we have to support and call for less siloing. And I think at the federal level, I know there's been some efforts to bring work from the disaster preparedness side with the adaptation, but there's a lot of room for improvement there. We know that there's a lot of work being done in disaster risk reduction, and Public Safety Canada, I know, is looking at that intersection of disaster risk reduction and adaptation. But again, I think we need to ramp that up because, we have two sort of parallel disciplines, industries, whatever you want to call them, that have traditionally not been speaking to and working with each other in many ways. And sometimes it's on the climate adaptation side, repeating lessons and learning that has already, a long established history in disaster management and vice versa. So I think that de-siloing of our institutions is going to be critical to meet this, because we know that the challenges, any complex challenge, any wicked challenge like climate change, requires that kind of transdisciplinary orientation, not an individual department orientation. And the budgets have to flow that way as well, because otherwise, people are only working to the budget that they have in the area that they have, and that continues to reinforce that siloing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Roman.
Rodrigo, just to focus the question a little bit again, are you asking for how we can cooperate across the country or across the sectors or within our communities, or can we reframe it whatever way we want?
I think however way you want it is good. Yeah, I think all of those are important considerations about this type of sharing of experiences and cooperation, for sure.
Yeah, so because climate adaptation, and that's really where we need to be right now. I think we know we're moving on mitigation, and that's such a big thing to have to deal with. We need lots of big initiatives at the mitigation level to bring us to where we have to be to get things under control, but we're going to need adaptation regardless. And that is going to happen on the ground in the local area for the most part. There will be the need for large provincial initiatives and support from federal government. There was a comment in the chat about the Chignecto Isthmus situation. That's not a local level initiative. That's a major concern that has to have, enforcement from all levels of government and many disciplines and right across the community. But in terms of just getting started, if we can just get started on the small things and build from there, that's really important. And so at the local community level, we have some really great examples getting started now in Nova Scotia. We've been looking at them. We have moderate-sized ones that have involved, the provincial, federal government together with, researchers in academia and professionals in practice, and also communities. So there's these efforts to move the dikes a bit back from the coast in a managed approach and regrow saltgrass marshes in front of the dikes, and that improves both the biodiversity of the area, but it supports, the resilience of the dikes in the long term too. And so these are initiatives that people see happening, in the communities. They see these events and they can see the benefits of them, and the dikes where they're situated are more robust and resilient for the protection they have in front of them. And there's less dike as well needed to protect these areas that need protection. And so that's just an example of something that's happening already. And so we promote those through, information sharing, whatever way we can get the word out. Recognition is huge. If something like that is happening, governments and agencies and organizations need to recognize these things and let people know about them and help them understand how they can do these things themselves. Or if you look at really small initiatives in Mahone Bay in Nova Scotia, they've come together as a community, their council and their staff and the people in the community, and decided, yeah, we want to install a living shoreline on our harbor. And that's going to be, they have the plans to do it. They took the initiative, and they understood the risk to the infrastructure there. They understood how it improves the community from an aesthetic and an enjoyment point of view recreationally, and also the biodiversity that it adds to the area. But they're stuck now because they have this plan and they need the money to install it. And so lo and behold, we have this wonderful Coastal Action is an NGO in the area, and they were able to bring in foundation funding to at least get a pilot going on it, we hope, is the news, but it's not the whole thing. It's a small municipality. They just don't have the finances to support that. And so, but if they did, it would be fantastic because they would get it built. This was supported through the work of an engineering firm who has expertise in this area and was able to get the plans in place. We've got so much expertise here. It's fantastic. But they need the funds to support it. And if they do it, then they will be an example for municipalities all around the province who have similar shorelines that would like to do the same thing. So it's really showing it can be done, and waving our flags as much as possible. That excites people. It gets people interested and they want to be engaged.
Oh, thanks, Patricia. I think that's a very important point that has come through from all the panelists regarding sort of that adaptation happens really at that community level, right? And getting communities engaged, but also sort of properly supported, I guess, with regards to how they can do that part of implementation. I'm just going to quickly just maybe have other panelists talk about this idea of sort of municipalities seem to be taking initiative. You know, we've heard here in Nova Scotia how they're preparing climate action plans and following through on many of their identified priorities, but then you know, they're certainly stuck with regards to some of the bigger implementation plans. So, you know, what could you know, the province, for example, do to support those communities? You know, funding obviously is a major factor, but how else could the province empower those communities and municipalities to be able to take action? Does anybody have any thoughts around that? And then we'll move on to audience Q&As, which I think are rolling in quite fast.
Steve, I see your microphone's down, but Rodrigo, just, I mean, very briefly, when you, you know, when you think of most municipalities, you know, they have, you know, they have hundreds of urgent things that they need to do at any given time. They have very limited budgets, limited taxation, and also ability to borrow on markets, et cetera. So, but I think it gets back to an earlier question. I mean, I think that you're seeing really interesting coalitions, not only in Nova Scotia, but across Canada, on sharing, you know, in sort of concrete case studies. I've been working a lot on nature-based solutions. And there's now in different platforms sharing literally tens of thousands of different examples of how nature-based solutions have been designed, how they worked with existing engineering infrastructure, how it was changed, what the performance were, and also really, really interesting, you know, sort of a consistent finding has been that these solutions represent a fraction of what would be a more conventional engineering solution. There's problems with that because engineers have a question about signing off on things what may not have the exact performance standards that their codes of practice require. But I think that that's one way of just being able to sort of share in real time networks, and also just the work, you know, the role of non-governmental organizations, of Ducks Unlimited and many others working on the ground on sharing practices. And the only thing I just mentioned, I'm really delighted to be working with Dr. Kevin Quigley of the Academy Institute on a panel report of the Council of Canadian Academies. It was with the charge of Public Safety Canada to look exactly at this siloed approach of government levels on looking at disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. And just to say, governments at the best of times are terrible at coordination, and I think this is amplified, particularly when you have long-term chronic risks like climate change.
I would just, Steve, go ahead.
I think I had in Quebec, I had a big deception a few years ago when the government cut the finance of the developer agency to make socioeconomic development. But I think could be very, very interesting to put some people like development agent, but integrating climate change. not only for one municipality, but maybe for a region, helping the community to reinforce their capacity themselves. And not only in terms of money, but in terms of reflection, to favorize the continuity of the reflection and the action in the future, adapting our decision-making process, but with people understanding that topic.
Can I just
Thanks.
add to the conversation? I responded to it in the chat, but I think it's a related question, which is, I think the other thing that we can do provincially, that you can do provincially in Nova Scotia, but also here in BC and elsewhere, is we have to make information more accessible. You know, there was a question in the chat about somebody wanting to build a new building, and, you know, where in you know, how do I know where to build it? How do I know the risks? And it's still very difficult to access information for professionals, let alone for an individual citizen trying to make these kinds of choices about where they buy a home, where they don't buy a home, where they build a multi-level home. And so there's a really, and I know there's efforts around flood risk mapping, et cetera, but it's still incredibly difficult to get access to information. I think that has to be one of our priorities, provincially and federally, so that we support communities being able to access locally relevant climate information, understand the locally and regionally relevant risks, and then understand what tools are available to them to plan. And this may include things like having you know, sort of itinerant planners that can reach out and work with local communities that may not have that capacity in their local area or government. This kind of capacity building can't be a sort of one-off or only in university or only in this sector. We really need to be investing in supporting communities, having access to data, having support in planning for their own adaptation measures, and connecting with other communities with other case examples so that they understand and can envision things that they may not have you know, envisioned previously. So if one community in BC is doing something on the coast, communities in Nova Scotia should know about that, vice versa. That kind of information sharing, those kinds of platforms are incredibly important to build the capacity of local communities, individuals, and businesses to respond to this.
Thanks. Interesting, Robin. There's a question actually that maybe speaks a little bit to that came addressed to you. So I'm going to start with that from the audience. And this is from Anne. It says, elites tend to have the financial resources to live on or near coastlines, and they typically know how to get the attention of government and other institutions. How might this be skewing the discussions and the allocation of resources in this respect?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's not something I've studied, but I think, you know, we know what you say is accurate. You know, the riskiest areas are often inhabited by the most privileged people, financially and otherwise. And so that said, I mean, I think we're focusing on those areas, but I don't think what we're doing, or at least we haven't done enough of, is to not let those interests sort of prevent us from enacting regulations, codes, you know, standards around buildings. And I think, I don't know what the answer is around, you know, how to, I mean, elites have influence in every aspect of our society. We, you know, it's not just around climate change. And we've seen lots of that pre-existing inequity revealed, not created by, but revealed through the pandemic. And I think partly being aware of it, calling for changes in our governance structures in that way, you know, so that there is greater voice and empowered voice in our government choices around where money is spent and what regulations are enacted and enforced, so that that imbalance between those with great privilege and those without is somehow ameliorated. And as I say, I mean, it's not just around climate change, that those economic inequities and those broader inequities are fueling climate change. Excuse the pun on the word fueling, but they are fueling climate change, and they are slowing down our efforts because it's not in the interests always of, or at least in the, I would say, the perceived understanding of stakeholders, shareholders, etc., to invest in the ways that we need to invest in this issue.
Thank you. Patricia, a question for you that's coming in. You mentioned that most municipal governments in Nova Scotia have written adaptation plans. What about rural communities, rural coastal communities that fall outside of municipal governments, small town administrative structures? How can these fully rural communities be reached and be helped to put adaptation plans in place?
Okay, so those are, first of all, I was talking about Nova Scotia action plans. So they're a combination of adaptation and mitigation, with the emphasis actually on adaptation, but they included both. All of Nova Scotia lies within most of Nova Scotia, not every bit of it, but the federal government's lands don't, within municipal control somewhat. The entire province is under some form of municipal planning authority. Then, so the question is, if they are referring to Nova Scotia, that's not it's not a concern, but it's just that we do have the ability to plan for rural areas in the province, and we will be, because there's now the provincial requirement, new planning, minimum planning regulations to plan for these rural spaces that might not have been planned for before. And a lot of them are along the shoreline. So we are, in other words, all this incorporated area, we have that benefit. It's a very powerful tool, frankly, and being able to do that, move ahead with it. It wasn't mandatory up until very recently, but it now is. And so these more rural municipalities are moving ahead with land use planning, and that will be a very important piece of the adaptation approach that we're going to be using in the province. For areas outside of Nova Scotia, so for some of our other Atlantic region provinces, they don't have the same sort of arrangement whereby municipalities, the entire landmass can be subject to, if that were the will of the government, I guess, to planning, to land use planning. And so they have to look to the provincial government in those places where they don't have cities or towns or incorporated areas for planning support. And so in that case, the provincial government, through plan regulations around subdivisions and environmental standards that provide for, setbacks, buffers along the shoreline, for instance, those will in Nova Scotia also come, those standards from the provincial level, but it'll be delivered through the municipalities by and large. In those other provinces, they have to turn to the provincial government to help them and for their planning services. And planning in rural areas is very, very tricky, as anyone who's involved in planning knows. It's a very different world and a very different environment from urban places. There's, the land pressures don't feel that you don't feel the land pressure quite that way, except when you're in this very narrow coastal zone region where there's a lot of pressure and people are very interested in being there. So, it's they really have to turn to the provincial government for the land use planning. And we don't have, I know in PEI, they've been looking for a long time now, sort of the comprehensive provincial level land use policy, still trying to move in that direction, but in that case, at least they would have sort of, a comprehensive overview of what you can and should not be doing with respect to land use, how to use the land to its best use, and do it in an environmentally and culturally appropriate way, with sensitivities towards agriculture and resource land use, and also the environmental needs. So again, we're kind of doing that in sort of different ways here in the province, where we're getting standards set by the province for how we're going to work at the shoreline. But yeah, I guess that's the best I can do on that answer.
No, that's great. Thank you, Patricia. I think that distinction with some particularities about rural communities is important as well. We are coming to the end of our time, unfortunately. As usual with these things, we could, go on and go on, and the audience is sending some more questions, but I'll move on with the agenda. we obviously want to thank everyone who has participated in the discussion. I would like to thank the speakers, obviously, once again, for your time and your thoughtful comments and your insight. To everyone watching, thank you for joining us. A video recording of today's panel discussion will be made available and shared on the McEachern Institute's YouTube channel and website. I do have a couple of just quick announcements on things that are coming up with the McEachern Institute. Next week's panel on race and party platforms in the coming Nova Scotia elections will take place on Thursday, March 11th at 1 p.m. And you can visit the dal.ca/MIPP website to register. Also, the McEachern Institute's OPED competition ends tonight at midnight. So if you are a registered student at DAL, get your submission in, and details on the competition can be found also at dal.ca/MIPP website. So once again, thank you everyone, Robin, Scott, Patricia, Steve. Thank you to the McEachern Institute, and thank you to all participants for your time. Take care, everyone.